So on this, which may well be the most momentous day of your lives, I have good news and bad news about your future. First, the bad news. Things are going to go horribly wrong. And now the good news. Things are going to go horribly wrong. Of course, what we wish for ourselves, particularly at beginnings like today, is that everything in our future goes according to plan. But if you're lucky, it won't. And when plans go haywire, sometimes this is the greatest blessing. The trick is, to see the blessing, we sometimes need to change our perspective. One day in the Peruvian Amazon, I was in need of just this. And that's how I found myself 7 stories up a machimango tree, hanging not by a slender thread, but by a thin enough rope. And below me, in the canoe that had carried me to this spot, people were fishing for piranhas. Not a good place to be, one might think. This might remind you of how you feel as you carry your newly minted degrees into today's troubled world. So what was I doing up that tree? I was looking for pink dolphins. Now, pink dolphins aren't like those pink elephants that used to appear to my mother after her 3rd or 4th martini. They really exist. They are real dolphins. But they live in fresh water, and they're sometimes gray, but sometimes they're hot pink or bubblegum pink. And I was in the Amazon working on a book about them, my 3rd big book, which was called Journey of the Pink Dolphins. And the first thing that went horribly wrong with this book was its entire premise fell through. I pitched it as a book in which I'd follow these little-known creatures on their migration, find out where they go when they migrate. I'd heard they were migratory at a conference from the world's top expert on them, Dr. Vera da Silva. So I show up in Brazil in Dr. da Silva's office. I've got my contract, I've got my photographer with me, and it was then that she revealed some unsettling news. She told me, turns out they don't migrate at all. That was the entire premise of my book. So now, things were looking even worse. Bad enough, I can't follow them on their non-existent migration, but these dolphins, unlike marine dolphins, they don't have tall dorsal fins. They don't spring out of the water. They're very difficult to see. They're just a low ridge shimmering on the water's surface. So during the first weeks I spent on my first expedition to the Amazon, first in Brazil and then in Peru, I could only spot fragments of the animals. I couldn't tell individuals apart. I couldn't even count how many there were. I tried watching from a canoe. I tried swimming in the black waters, opening my eyes beneath the water to try to see them. But it didn't work, which might have been good because later I found out that there were all kinds of piranhas and electric eels in the water. Couldn't see them either. So finally, trying to get the perspective of height, and by climbing as high as I could, I hoped that I could peer down and penetrate the water's surface. That's why I was up that tree. So there I was, my weight hanging in the grips of this climbing apparatus that mountain climbers use to scale cliffs, with leather loops about my thighs and belly. To ascend, you step into a sort of noose and you straighten the leg, you pull up with your arms, sliding a knot the length of the step, and you do it again and again and again. And I'd never done this before. I shook with fear and exertion. But finally, it felt like the tree itself was calling me up. So up I climbed. into this world I did not know existed. The treetop was a new universe full of life. Giant centipedes curled in the crevices of its bark. Snails clung to the undersides of leaves. A galaxy of orchids perched on the taller branches. Up and up I climbed, past two pendula nests. Two sets of parent birds had wisely built their purse-like nurseries alongside an enormous wasp's nest, bigger than a pumpkin. It was like having a police station on your block. Up I climbed past this giant swollen termite nest, close enough to smell that it smelled like cedar. The insects use this to repel other insects. And up I climbed past vines who were climbing with me, only slower, on their hunt for light. I climbed up past one branch where there was a plant called a bromeliad perched. It's a relative of the pineapple. Its overlapping leaves form a bowl in which rainwater collects. And I looked in, and inside the bowl was a mini world of water, a tiny lake full of its own biota. There was a frog in there, and wiggling mosquito larvae, and snails, and a beetle, and someone had laid their eggs in there, maybe a salamander or some water-living insect. Scientists have, in fact, cataloged 500 species that can live just in the rainwater collected in a bromeliad's bowl. It's a tiny lake, all of its own. And then I reached the top of the rope, and I looked down, and below me I saw parakeets zooming and butterflies fluttering, and the water was still as dark and impenetrable as night. I could see no dolphins. So was my climb a failure? Far from it. I didn't see what I expected or hoped to see. I didn't get just a better view of something I already knew. Instead, I'd been given a glimpse of a treetop world that few of us in the US even dream of existing on this planet. I was given a far more exciting and profound view, an unexpected insight, a surprise gift. And that's a pretty good working definition of a blessing. And so many times in my life, I've found myself in a similar situation. In India, I was researching my second book called Spell of the Tiger, and I traveled to Sundarban, which is this huge mangrove forest that stretches between India and Bangladesh. I had set up everything in advance. I had a translator. I had a speedboat. A PhD biologist who spoke perfect English as well as Bengali was going to go with me. And every one of those things fell through the first day I ended up in India. P.S. I got stuck out there in Sundarban in a reserve with 500 man-eating tigers. The women stay home where they're eaten by crocodiles. They really are man-eaters. And India declared martial law. So I could not leave, and there was no chance of anyone else coming who might be my translator. But you know what happened? Because of this, I was forced to use my own eyes and ears and my rudimentary Bengali to see and feel this place firsthand and to make relationships with the local people that would not have been possible if I had been with a PhD biologist. And I got to write about this unique place and culture in a way that no one else had ever done. And the same thing happened when I showed up at Gombe Stream Reserve in Tanzania at Jane Goodall's invitation for my first book. Jane Goodall was my childhood heroine, but she stood me up. But again, although my heart was broken, it was a blessing. because I ended up being able again to make observations of the apes on my own that I would not have been able to do if I was following Jane around. Same thing happened in northern Thailand. I was researching another book called Search for the Golden Moon Bear. Thought I was on the trail of a new species. It wasn't. But everywhere we went, it just seemed like a disaster. We would go to a place and find empty forests where all the animals had been killed. We would find parks that were overrun with refugees who were displaced and experiencing terrible tragedies, and they were killing and eating all the animals. We were finding people without legs, without arms, who'd been blown apart by landmines. I even met an elephant who had lost a leg to a landmine while she was forced to do illegal logging in Burma. I felt my luck had really run out. And I was certain that this book was going to be so depressing, it was going to have to come with a cyanide tablet in the end. Well, one of our expeditions led me into northern Thailand, and we visited a village of Lahu Na to talk with the local hunters about the bears. And one of the interviewees happened to be a shaman. So after the interview, he generously offered to conduct a soul binding ceremony to keep my soul from fluttering off. And they bind your wrists with thread. As he was looking at my wrists, he suddenly exclaims, "These are the luckiest wrists I've ever seen." Because the way they tell your fortune is not looking at your palm, but your wrist. And I realized the shaman was right. It was my tremendous good fortune to be exactly there, exactly then, witnessing what I needed to see in order to bring this news back to my readers, so that we might help do something about these sorrows at a critical time in our history. And as for my book on pink dolphins, to this day, I think it's one of my best yet. I did not follow them on their non-existent migration, but I did follow them in another way, more like a disciple follows a teacher. I followed them through people's stories and myths. I followed them back in time, thanks to an evolutionary biologist who took me back to the time when whales once walked on land. And on my final trip, off a remote slip of land in the Tapajós River in Brazil, I was able to recognize 7 pink dolphins who would come to me as I swam in the river, and I could even feel them sounding me with their echolocation. They even would blow bubbles beneath me, which would sizzle up over my skin. And I found out that in captivity, they'll often do this to each other, almost like giving a massage. So on this important day, my advice to you is twofold. First, like a runner or a jockey, get in position to be ready to receive blessings. That means sometimes being willing to literally go out on a limb for something meaningful, something you believe in, something bigger than yourself. And don't buy the lie that the so-called real world is all about just being safe and secure and accumulating money and a bunch of stuff. Because the real world, the world that we love, is a green, living world full of real dangers and stunning beauty and breathtaking surprises. So, go out in the world where your heart calls you, and don't be afraid. And sometimes you will have to be brave, but the blessings will come. I promise you that. They did to me, and they will to you. And the second thing I wish for you is the insight to recognize the blessings as such. And sometimes it's hard, but you'll know it's a blessing if you are enriched and transformed by their experience. So be ready. All you now graduating, you are, in a sense, hanging, as I was, by a slender rope 7 stories up a machimango tree. My wish for you today is that you enjoy the view. Congratulations, and thank you.